2020 was such a weird year. We saw a global pandemic, global lockdowns that followed, and what felt like a global revolution in the streets. We were trapped inside for months and then watched our black and brown neighbors somehow still being slain. Do you feel like anything thrived more in 2020 than systemic racism? We're going to talk to some influential folks who are and have been working behind the scenes in the police reform and larger mass liberation movement. Hey everyone, I'm excited to move on to part two of this interview series. In this next segment, I'm going to be talking to Tim Jackson, who is from Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. Tim actually took it into his own hands to research and do data analysis on the police and his community and some of the trends that he could find, if any. Me and Tim had a really great conversation where he revealed to me some of his findings. And I want to remind you all, as usual, the questions in this interview are asked independent of my own political opinions, of my own personal perspective. These are questions that were generated from different people on social media platforms that were interested in this subject. And my questions don't necessarily reflect my own personal beliefs or political opinions, and neither does Tim's responses to those questions. But I hope you all enjoy it, and I hope it's informative. Thank you, Tim, for joining me and taking some time here before the holidays to talk to me about some of these efforts that are going on around the movement behind police reform. I really appreciate you for being here. For those who don't know you, Tim, who are you?
I'm Tim Jackson, a resident of Pennsylvania, a central part of the state. And just like probably some of those who are going to view this, a concerned citizen. And so, as a normal guy, doing some normal things, I wanted to bring some attention to some of the things that I saw around me, and I'm sure others have seen or observed around themselves as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. One question I wanted to ask you is, what is your role in this movement behind reforming the police?
Interesting question. So I'm not quite sure, and here's what I mean. I think it stems back to back when Trayvon Martin was killed, murdered. One thing that always stuck with me, and that's everybody can do something. I didn't know what that something was. I didn't know where to start, so I started asking questions. And the more questions I asked, the more questions I had. And so I think my role is to try to answer as many questions as I can for myself, and then put those same answers out to people who might have similar questions, right? And so I think if I had to summarize, my role is to provide some answers and maybe some questions upon some questions that people might have, and let those actions result from where those questions lead. That's all I see my role as, someone who can deliver some answers to some questions that linger.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing there. I think some people might be able to relate to that who are watching this. And so the reason why I wanted to talk to you in particular, Tim, is because you've done some really great work in researching your local police department. And I wanted to understand, first of all, what you found. What trends were there? Were there any trends? And was there anything that stuck out most? Like if there was a headline for your research and what was uncovered in it, what would that be?
Headline is what some people see nationally is happening all around them. I think when I take a look back and think back at the analysis that I put together, Um, the very headlines that you see on the news were taking place in my own neighborhood, and to me that's a problem, right? So specifically, you can think of people of color. Yes, in my analysis, they're being stopped more often. They're being penalized more harshly. They are focused around males of color in particular, and where there's the choice between warnings, citations, arrests, and non-arrests, the more criminalized people of color become. And that's up and down the spectrum, male and female, um, Black, Asian, Hispanic. There's a definite trend that people of color, in my view, based on my statistics and analysis, are being targeted by the police.
Wow. And to some people that may be surprising, and to some others it may just feel really familiar. Um, so I want to take a sidestep really quick. What is your neighborhood like? Are you in the suburbs? Are you in the city? What's your neighborhood like?
Yeah, so I live in Cumberland County, and for those who may not be familiar, it's a suburb of Harrisburg. About 5% of the county's population are people of color, and obviously 95% are white. And so there are very few Black, Hispanic, Asian that are in this county at all. And so a lot of the figures that I were able to measure reflect very stark um, trends in terms of how many people of color are stopped in relation to their fair share of population. And so to give you a real example, like I said, 5% of the county are people of color. 23% of those stopped by police in my local jurisdiction were people of color, right? So almost 5 times their fair share of population are getting stopped by the police and then ultimately cited.
Wow. And um, to people listening, that may be uh, a striking number to hear when you're talking about 5% of the people in that community being people of color, and the other 95% being Caucasian, white people, and then you have this trend of people being targeted, specifically uh, men of color, at a much higher rate is insane. It's really hard to grapple. Is there any cause that you can ascertain from any of this research? Any reason? Maybe some people would argue, some people would put forth that maybe just lack of bias training and prejudice training. Is there anything that you've been able to ascertain from that?
Yeah, the largest surprise I had in the work that I've done, I should mention I've spent some time with the department talking about my research. Um, and this sounds a little bit elementary, but when I talked to the officers themselves and the police chief, I was reminded that they're people, right? People always think about police officers as being some um, conglomerate of a force. Well, they're people first, and the reason why I bring that up is because as people first, they come with their own implicit bias. The only difference between they and anybody else is that they have a police car and a badge and a gun. And so when you add those together, they then have the ability to make decisions based on the biases that they already have. And that has consequences. And so I think the biggest moment of surprise for me is, well, they don't really see themselves as being biased. And I bet if anybody asks anyone else, they said, oh, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not biased, but they do have prejudices and they do have biases. And the only difference between they and the cops are those three things: the cop car, the badge, and the gun. And those have consequences.
Wow. And I really think that that is actually common, what you hit on there. People often do forget to acknowledge that police officers are police officers, of course, but they're also humans, and humans make mistakes. But some people would say that there is a decreased margin of error that should exist there when you're talking about someone who has that badge, that car, and that gun. They can take human life, and they have. And so, do you have any reason to believe from your research, or any other reason that may exist to believe that prejudice and bias training may be effective in curbing some of the things that you found within your research?
At this time, I do not. And here's what I mean. The department that I am currently working with has had bias training before, during, and after the time frame of my research. Um, and the disturbing trends continue. Um, what I think probably needs to be looked at is what that bias training comprises, who's actually teaching it, and then what are those ultimate follow-ups or post follow-ups in terms of you went through the training, you absorb the training, and then what happens is nothing happens, right? There's no accountability, and so the piece that needs to happen is that post follow-up. Take a look at what the stops and the police activity actually reveals, and did that training actually have a meaningful impact on the way that civilians were handled? And that to me is the piece that's most important that I don't believe most, if any, departments actually take a look at.
I appreciate that, Tim. And I want to move forward to our next segment of this and our next question here. Um, you know, some people say we need to reform the police, but there are others who say we simply need to defund and abolish the police because there's no hope through prejudice training or implicit bias training. And the only way we can change the police is to hold them accountable by their actions in the past. And so that will come through defunding, that will come through abolition. What would you say to that?
I'll be honest, I don't believe in the word defund. I think it underscores some of the division that we are up against. The first word that is used or with the word defund is, apprehension, in my view. I think a better word would be to um, uh, redefine. Okay. For instance, police officers should not be called out for mental health issues. They should not be called out for any variety of social, um, everyday things that go on. And I think there is a place for police that, yeah, I think there's a place for police um, in society where that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, right? So when we think about defunding, it's more about redefining, making sure that people feel safe, comforted, protected, um, and not necessarily penalized for having everyday challenges that life brings.
Thank you for expounding upon that a little bit more. Former President Obama recently spoke in terms of defunding the police, and he said much of the same things that you said. He said that it can be divisive, and it tends to alienate people. Um, some of the other people that I've interviewed um, uh, seem to see that more as tone policing, where you are telling the people whose side that you should be on, that they should say it nicer. They should speak more nicely towards the general audience that they're speaking towards. Would you have any response to that?
Um, I would replace the word nice with direct. I think you can have direct conversation with people you may have questions about or disagreements with, and you can have those discussions in a reasonable and rational tone. Um, I think the word nice lends itself to inaction, right? And so that would be my concern with that word. There's no I think issue with people being direct about what they're after, what they need, and how those who are there to serve and protect can look at their roles differently. And none of that has to be a nice conversation.
Thank you so much, Tim. And just really quick on this whole defund abolition thing. So what I think I hear you saying is that you don't necessarily like the language, but do you agree with the end goals? Do you think that reallocation of funds maybe is something that may be more acceptable of language for you. But the idea of moving the funds, reallocating the funds to mental health services and housing and other areas that help the community besides policing, is that something that you think that you could get behind?
Absolutely. And I'll give a real example. We talked about training. Um, Instead of hiring an outside consultant that flies in once every year for a 3 hour speech that everybody drinks coffee and talks through, actually place someone in that role, and have them report directly to the chief of police, to make sure that everybody understands the importance of that training, the importance of the accountability behind it. And so I do believe in redefining that role. I do believe in redirecting some of those funds to other areas where they could help the public in a more positive fashion. Um, and I also believe that police are an extremely critical part of our society. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all.
Yeah, I hear that, and so I'm hearing a one key difference here with that role that you're speaking of, which may not be a bad role if we're going to keep the police, and that's not for me or you to decide right here, right now. But one thing that I'm hearing there is that that role will exist inwards, meaning it's going to help the police become better, hopefully. And I think that what they're asking for is that those funds be reallocated outside the police department so that it's helping the community on this other side over here. So would you agree with that? That money completely leaving the police department and going towards building a recreational center or having affordable housing in the community, free housing in the community is something that has been brought up. Having mental health advocates respond to the scene as they have done in Eugene, Oregon, I believe it is that something that you could get behind? Have that money leave the police department completely and go towards the community?
Honestly, I could get behind anything that makes the community better. Do I think that one size fits all? No. Do I think what would serve New York City versus a Cumberland County officer would be the same? No. But I think, especially where, and I'll use that as a quick example, the difference between New York City is you already have the diversity. Okay. And so the tools effectively should already be in place. It's just a matter of utilizing those tools. The same tools are not available in more rural societies, right? So their needs are different. Housing needs are different. And so to answer the question, yes, I think that different districts, different jurisdictions should be allowed to have those funds used differently as the society around them demands.
Thank you so much, Tim. And so before I move to the next segment, I really want to just also clarify here on in terms of abolition. Uh, would you be able to get behind uh, police abolition if it were not called police abolition? Would you be able to get behind completely dismantling uh, law enforcement agencies, local police departments across the United States, and replacing them with another body that acts in a different manner as determined by that community?
No, I think the way to handle that is to have police officers respond differently, be trained differently, be staffed differently. Um, what's striking to me is I've had the good fortune of traveling around the world. And I will tell you that the police act completely differently as compared to the United States. For example, if you were ever to go to Germany and Oktoberfest, you can only imagine what that looks like, right? And so after a few hours, things don't look that great. The police there are not there to arrest people at all. They're in fact there to help people. Make sure they get home safely, make sure that they have someone to call, make sure that they have a taxi and that the taxi driver knows where to take them. And so when we think about police, I think in the United States, it's in the lens of how we've always been taught, but universally and globally, that's not the case. And so I think were we to step back and say, hey, what are really the great models of policing that we should look at? That's what we should be doing. Incidentally, the United States is one, if not the least trained policing country in the world. So what does that mean? It means that many countries in Europe understudy or apprentice policing for years. That's not the case in the United States, and so there is a challenge with training that we have. But I think it's focusing on those areas where we need to be focused and using those best practices globally where we can find.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that perspective there, Tim. I think that uh, a lot of people are looking at this from a very, very American centralized view. Um, but American policing is a unique challenge to attack right now to try to understand how it can be improved, if it can be improved, because its origins is unique compared to the rest of the world. Um, and so that's an aspect that a lot of people may push back on that in terms of saying that our problem is a unique one. Um, and that's something that I think that we'll continue to have discourse around in this country um, until we really figure out what works. But moving into my last question here, um, what would you say is the end goal of your work? What would you say is the ultimate thing that you're trying to achieve in doing this?
Uh, you've asked some good questions. That one's an easy one, so I'll answer it one word: change. I will not stop until I see change. And I don't quite know when that will happen. I will just say that every day I get up with a different perspective on what I can do to move the ball forward. And I'm energized by those thoughts, those actions, and the responses I'm getting from some of those actions. And so my end goal is change.
Thank you, Tim. Since I gave you such an easy one, I do have some follow up on that. Would you say, based on what you saw, at least the police that you researched, would you say that they're racist?
I would say that they are. Uh, I'll answer it this way. I will say that they do not think that they're racist. And I believe them when they say that. Um, I've had the good fortune of talking to them and having both semi-personal and professional conversation, and I do not believe that they believe that they're racist. That doesn't change the outcome. Okay. It doesn't change the facts that I've been able to find. And so the outcome doesn't really care about what they think. The outcome is what it is. And the outcome suggests that the way that they act and the actions prior to some of those, the outcomes were racist. And that's a fact.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think that does answer all of my questions. And I appreciate you so much for taking the time out of your evening and your holiday schedule to be here with me. I'm sure this will be very informative, but also um, it'll cause the wheels to turn for a lot of people, and I hope it does. So thank you very much, Tim.